On a Thursday morning in October of 2011, a rusted white dump truck backed up the gravel lane behind a small cedar-shingled house on the edge of a tidal creek in Carteret County, North Carolina, and unloaded 400 pounds of empty oyster shells beside Margaret Halvorsen's storage shed. The driver did not knock. He did not leave a note. He simply pulled the lever, watched the shells tumble out in a dry white cascade, and drove off down the lane toward the paved road that ran along the Newport River. Maggie was 34 years old, standing at her kitchen sink with a cup of coffee going cold in her hand, watching a mountain of broken cups and pale gray fragments settle beside her grandfather's old boat shed like something the sea had already used up and set aside. She stood there for a long moment. Then she set down the cup and walked outside. That was the beginning of something nobody in the town of Beaufort saw coming. Not the oyster plant, not the wholesaler crowd, not the men at the counter of the Meeks Feed and Farm Supply on Front Street. Not Harlan Meeks himself, who in the years that followed would become the loudest voice in the county, insisting that what Maggie Halvorsen was doing behind that shed was a cute little cottage industry at best. Nobody saw it coming, but looking back now, it is hard to understand how they missed it, because everything you needed to know was standing right there on the shell path that morning. A young widow in her late husband's flannel shirt, watching a truck drive away, and already thinking about what to do next. Let me tell you about Maggie Halvorsen, because you need to understand the woman before you can understand what she built. She was born in 1977, the only child of a boatyard owner. Her grandfather had come over from a fishing village in western Norway in 1949, and had put every dollar he made into a stretch of marshland where he built by hand a small wooden boat shop and the cedar-shingled house that faced the water. Maggie had grown up watching men turn raw yellow pine into working skiffs, watching her grandfather sort shell fragments the way other men sorted coins, watching the tide come in and out twice a day, and rearrange the small things at the edge of the creek. She was a careful child, not shy, careful. She kept a jar on her windowsill from the age of 6 that she filled with what she called findings. A piece of blue sea glass, a whelk shell with a hole worn through it, a copper rivet from an old boat. Her mother once asked her why she saved such things. Maggie said, because somebody threw them away and they were still good. By 11, she could grade a stack of cedar planks by grain and tell you which ones would warp and which ones would hold true. She went to the University of North Carolina at Wilmington on a partial scholarship and studied marine biology. She had a professor there her sophomore year, a man named Dr. Elias Thorne, who taught coastal ecology. On the first day of that class in the fall of 1998, Dr. Thorne stood at the front of the lecture hall and said, "The ocean has been perfecting materials for 400 million years, and every one of them ends up on a shore somewhere. And every one of them is worth more than the shipping cost of moving it." Maggie wrote that down. She underlined it twice. She carried it home when she left school in her junior year to marry a young commercial fisherman named John Halvorsen. And she carried it with her through the birth of her son Sam, and through the January morning in 2009, when a nor'easter caught John's boat off Cape Lookout, and he did not come home. She was 32 years old with a 9-year-old boy. She took a part-time job keeping books for a seafood wholesaler in Beaufort. She kept Dr. Thorne's sentence pinned inside a kitchen cabinet on a scrap of index card where she saw it every morning. Let me tell you about the oyster plant, because it is the other half of this story. The Coastal Shell Company had been shucking oysters on the Newport River since 1964. By 2011, they processed roughly 20,000 bushels a season, which meant they generated an enormous quantity of empty shell. State law required most of it to go back for reef restoration, but there was always a surplus. The plant paid a hauler named Wade Coburn to move that surplus to a leased dredge spoil site 400 yards further down the creek. In the fall of 2011, Wade began mistakenly unloading his cargo on the wrong turnaround. He was unloading it directly onto the gravel apron beside Maggie Halvorsen's shed. The first load arrived that Thursday in October. Wade never came out to check where he had dumped. Maggie walked out to the pile and spent an hour turning shells over in her hands. She saw right away what most people would not have seen. These were culled halves and clean fragments. Freshwater rinsed, no meat residue. Grade 1 calcium carbonate with trace marine minerals from the estuary still intact. She had been reading quietly for 6 months by then. She had ordered 2 books from a horticultural supplier in Asheville and a third from a small press in Maine. She had been studying soil chemistry and calcium availability and the specific reasons that gardeners in coastal climates struggle with acidic soil and blossom end rot. She brought a handful of shell inside that afternoon. She laid it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. Then she went to the shed and got her grandfather's old iron mortar and pestle. Now let me ask you something. How many times have you looked at something everyone else was throwing away and wondered if they were wrong? How many times have you had that thought and let it go because the gap between thought and action felt too wide to cross? Maggie Halvorsen was not a person who let that gap stop her. She was a person who went and got the mortar. Roughly 1 in every 3 bushels of oysters harvested along the North Carolina coast produces shell material technically defined as post-consumer waste. Reef restoration programs, first mandated in 1973, recycle most of it back into estuarine habitat. But surplus and grading losses have historically meant that up to 15% of shell material by weight never makes it back to the water. That 15% is, chemically, one of the purest sources of calcium carbonate available on the American East Coast. And until recently, it has been treated by the industry that produces it as an inconvenience to be paid off rather than a resource to be captured. Part 2. Let me tell you about the first batch, because the first batch is the reason any of this matters. It took her 19 days. She worked in the evenings after Sam was asleep, and on Saturday mornings before he woke up. She crushed shell by hand in her grandfather's iron mortar, a cup at a time, screening the crushed material through an old brass flour sifter she found in the back of a kitchen drawer. She graded by particle size the way her grandfather had graded cedar plank by grain. Coarse fragments went in one bucket for slow-release supplement. Fine grade went in another for fast-acting amendment. Powder went in a third for foliar spray. She tested pH with strips ordered from a catalog. She tested calcium availability by dissolving samples in dilute acetic acid and measuring reaction time. She wrote everything down in a spiral notebook she kept on the kitchen counter next to a jar of coffee. She filled 40 small burlap sacks with graded shell that first month, 2 pounds per sack. She hand-lettered a paper tag for each one. Halvorsen Coastal Shell. She drove 22 miles up the coast to a small organic nursery in Havelock. She walked in with 3 sacks in her arms and asked for the owner. A woman named Elena Prescott came out from the back, 61 years old, gray braided, dirt under her fingernails. Elena picked up one of the sacks, opened it, rolled a pinch of the fine grade between her thumb and forefinger, and smelled it. She said, "This is clean shell. Where did you get it?" Maggie told her the truth. Elena said, "I will take all 40. She sold them for $18 a sack. Elena bought them for $12. Maggie drove home with $480 in an envelope on the passenger seat and cried once, quickly, at a red light in Beaufort. Then she drove the rest of the way with her hands steady on the wheel and a list already forming of what she needed to make more. Let me tell you about what happened at the Meeks Feed and Farm Supply in the spring of 2012. Because that is where the story takes its first public turn. The store on Front Street was the kind of place where the important conversations happened before they happened anywhere else. It was run by a man named Harlan Meeks, who was 64 and had inherited the store from his father and had been the informal authority on regional garden retail since 1983. Harlan Meeks was not a cruel man. He was a certain man, which in some ways is harder to argue with than cruelty. His comprehensive theory of what coastal gardeners bought did not include a young widow selling burlap sacks of oyster shell at $20 apiece. Maggie came in one April morning with 2 sample sacks in a canvas tote. She set them on the counter. She had brought a folder with her pH data and calcium availability tests. Harlan Meeks picked up one of the sacks, weighed it in his hand, opened it, poured a little into his palm, and then looked at the price tag she had attached. It said $20. The silence lasted about 3 seconds. Then he started to laugh. It was not a mean laugh exactly. It was the laugh of a man who had watched 40 years of hopeful newcomers try to sell coastal North Carolina something it did not want. It was the sound of a man who knew the customer, knew the season, knew the county, and could not quite believe that a young woman was standing in front of him with a burlap sack of crushed oyster shell priced at $20. "Maggie," he said, and his voice had the gentleness of a man explaining something obvious. "Coastal gardeners around here buy pelletized ag lime in a plastic sack. $6 at the co-op, $12 if they want the fancy one. They are not going to pay $20 for crushed shell in a burlap sack. This is a cute little cottage industry. I mean that kindly. He pushed the sack back across the counter. Maggie picked up both sacks and put them in the tote. She looked at Harlan Meeks and said, "How much do they spend on ag lime over 10 years? And how much of the calcium in that ag lime is actually plant available in coastal soil?" He blinked. She said, "Mine is 94% bioavailable. I have the data." Harlan Meeks smiled the smile of a man who has already made up his mind. "Good luck with it, Maggie," he said. She drove home along the coastal road with the windows down. She did not tell Sam about the conversation that night. She wrote 3 things in her notebook: bioavailability data, produce formal lab certification, price resistance at 20, test 24. Harlan Meeks said no, come back in 2 years. Let me tell you about the science, because the science is the part most people who laughed at her never bothered to understand. The standard soil amendment at farm supply stores along the coast in 2012 was pelletized dolomitic limestone, a ground mineral bonded into small pellets with clay. It is cheap to produce and easy to apply. But in sandy acidic soils with high rainfall, the pellets move through the root zone faster than the calcium can be released. A gardener who applies ag lime in March may see only 40% of the intended calcium reach the plants by August. The rest has washed out. The oyster shell Maggie was processing was pure biogenic calcium carbonate. Her fine grade had a particle size between 2 and 8 microns, which meant it entered the root zone directly and dissolved at a rate matched to plant uptake. The trace minerals still bonded to the shell, magnesium, strontium, iodine, were the same minerals coastal soils are chronically depleted of. A soil sample from Elena Prescott's greenhouse, tested at a lab in Raleigh, showed application of 2 pounds per 100 square feet, had raised bioavailable calcium by 240% compared to control plots amended with ag lime at 4 times the rate. She had the report. She kept it in the kitchen drawer. She also had the economics. Wade Coburn was still dumping the wrong turnaround. Her material cost per sack: burlap, twine, tag, fuel to run the small electric mill her brother-in-law Jonas had built her, came to $2.10. Her retail price was $20. Her gross margin on materials alone was above 82%. Bioavailable calcium is one of the most limiting nutrients for coastal vegetable and flower gardens along the American Southeast. Blossom end rot in tomatoes, tip burn in lettuce, and cavity spot in carrots are all direct symptoms of calcium deficiency that gardeners routinely misdiagnose as watering problems. Traditional agricultural lime was developed for the row crops of the Midwest and was never designed for the fast-draining, location exchange soils of the coastal Southeast. Part 3. Let me tell you about the years between 2013 and 2017, because they are the years most people skip over when they tell this story, and they are the years that made everything else possible. Maggie did not quit her bookkeeping job. She did not take out a loan. She worked at the seafood wholesaler 4 mornings a week, kept her son fed and in school, and processed shell in the shed in the afternoons and on weekends. And she sold through every channel she could find that did not require Harlan Meeks' approval. She sold at the Beaufort Farmers Market on Saturdays. She sold at the Moorhead City Garden Show in April of 2013, where she rented a booth for $60 and sold 84 sacks in 2 days. She sold to an heirloom rose nursery outside New Bern that placed a standing order of 30 sacks a month. She sold through a quarter-page ad in a regional garden magazine that generated 71 orders over a year. She also got better. The hand crushing of the first months was gone. Jonas had built her a proper 2-stage grinding rig from a repurposed feed mill. She developed a system for classifying each incoming shell load by moisture content and surface condition, sorting the freshest and cleanest shells for her premium fine grade, and routing older material to the coarse grade supplement. Nothing was wasted. The finest dust from the second screen she mixed with dried kelp and packed into small jars as a foliar spray she sold to organic tomato growers for $9 a jar. In 2014, she sold 1,400 sacks and about 300 jars. In 2015, she sold 2,200 sacks and 800 jars. Her revenue in 2015 crossed $50,000. Sam was 13 by then, quiet like his father had been, and worked in the shed after school for an hourly wage Maggie insisted on paying him. He was good at grading shell. Eric Halvorsen, her father-in-law, watched all of this from a careful distance. He was 71 years old, a retired boat builder who had lost his son, and now watched his daughter-in-law raise his grandson in the same house on the same creek where the boy's father had grown up. He was not an interfering man. He came by on Sundays for dinner. He asked how the numbers looked. He listened, but he was a boat builder, and boat builders along the coast have a particular relationship with new ventures, which is that they are things other people do when they have not yet learned what work is. He read the order book on the counter the way he read tide charts. In August of 2016, he came to her after Sunday dinner and sat at the kitchen table and said, "How much space do you need?" She looked at him. He said, "The old boat shed. It has been empty since your grandfather closed the yard. You can have it." That was Margaret Halvorsen saying he had been watching, and he had decided. Let me tell you about Hurricane Florence, because that is when everything shifted, and it shifted quietly, in the specific way that important things shift when everyone else is looking at the storm. Florence made landfall at Wrightsville Beach in September of 2018. It stalled over eastern North Carolina for 3 days and dropped over 30 inches of rain across Carteret County. The boatyards along the Newport River flooded to the rafters. The fishing fleet was grounded for 11 weeks. The seafood wholesaler where Maggie had kept books for 9 years lost its freezer inventory to a power outage and closed its doors in November. Every family in Beaufort was making calculations that had no good answers. Maggie's operation was untouched. The old boat shed sat 40 feet above the creek on a ridge her grandfather had built up with dredge spoil in 1952. It did not flood. The shell mountain behind the shed did not care about wind or water. And the demand from her inland distributors, nurseries in Charlotte and Raleigh, garden centers in Asheville, was completely unaffected by a coastal hurricane. Orders in the third quarter of 2018 came in at $18,000, the strongest quarter she had ever posted. By November, with the wholesaler closed and her bookkeeping income gone, the shell operation was her only income. It was also, she realized as she looked at the numbers, that Thanksgiving, more than sufficient. She had crossed $100,000 in annual revenue. Margaret Halvorsen came to Sunday dinner the week after Thanksgiving. He sat at her kitchen table and looked at the storm damage list, and then at the monthly revenue report she had begun leaving on the counter. He sat there for a long time. Then he said, "You were right." Maggie was standing at the sink. She just nodded. He said, "What do you need?" She told him. 2 employees, a commercial-grade screening plant, a delivery van. He said, "Do it." Let me tell you about what happened in the fall of 2019, because that is when Harlan Meeks came to the shed. He drove out on a Tuesday afternoon in October in his pickup unannounced. Maggie was in the old boat shed when he arrived. 2 women hired that summer were at the bagging jigs. Sam was home from his freshman year at community college and was operating the coarse grade screen. Harlan Meeks stood in the doorway a moment, looking at the operation. Then he took his cap off. "I heard you are doing $700,000, he said. Maggie said, "About 300. He said, "What are you doing?" She said, "About 300,000 this year, closer to 400 next year." He looked at the wall of graded shell buckets and the labeled screen frames and the shelf of finished sacks. Then he said, "I told you it had a ceiling." Maggie looked at him. She said, "You told me coastal gardeners around here buy pelletized ag lime in a plastic sack. $6 at the co-op, $12 if they want the fancy one, and they are not going to pay $20 for crushed shell in a burlap sack." She had it word for word. He blinked. She said, "I did not build a cottage industry. I built a manufacturer that uses hand grading to make a product the market was not being served." He was quiet. Then he said, "I would like to carry your product." She said, "I know. A single acre of established oyster reef along the North Carolina coast filters an estimated 2.4 million gallons of estuarine water per day. Post-industrial shell reclamation programs began appearing along the mid-Atlantic seaboard in the early 1990s, but most were focused on volume return to state reef sites, rather than on graded high-value applications. The material was treated by the shellfish industry primarily as a disposal cost. Part 4. Let me tell you about the moment the story became something larger than Carteret County, because it happened quietly, the way most important things happen. In the spring of 2020, a garden writer for a regional lifestyle magazine in Raleigh drove out to the shed and spent a day with Maggie and wrote a long feature about the operation. The article ran in the June issue under the headline, "What the Tide Brought In." Maggie did not love the headline. She would have preferred something about the soil chemistry, but the article itself was careful and accurate. It described the science, the grading system, The shell recovery arrangement she had by then formalized with the Coastal Shell Company, the numbers, and the small cedar shed on the creek where the whole thing had started. The article was picked up by a national gardening publication in October. That publication was read by a purchasing manager at a mid-Atlantic garden supply chain based in Richmond, who had been searching for a boutique regional soil amendment to add to a heritage line his company was launching. He called Maggie in November. She took the call at the kitchen table with her notebook open. The Richmond chain had 31 stores across Virginia, North Carolina, and eastern South Carolina. They wanted to carry 2 grades of Halvorsen Coastal Shell. Minimum commitment was 600 sacks per quarter across all stores. Maggie did the math in her notebook while he was talking. She said, "I can do that." He said, "Can you guarantee consistent grading at that volume?" She said, "Yes." He said, "How?" She said, "Because I built the grading before I built the volume. Call any of my current wholesale accounts." He called 4 of them. He called her back the following week. He said, "We would like to start in April." She said, "I will need a signed purchase order and 20% down." He said, "That is not standard." She said, "It is for me." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right." That contract pushed Halvorsen Coastal Shell past $300,000 in revenue for the 2021 fiscal year. By 2023, with 2 additional regional distributors added, revenue crossed $450,000. Eric Halvorsen died in the summer of 2022 at 78 years old, quietly, in the room he had been born in on a farm outside Ocracoke. He had watched the shell operation grow from a mistaken dump load on a gravel apron to a small manufacturing business with 9 employees, a converted boat shed processing plant, a delivery van with the Halvorsen name lettered on the side by a sign painter in Beaufort, and a regional distribution network that reached from Norfolk to Charleston. He had never once said anything that could be interpreted as surprise. He had watched. He had given her the boat shed. He had said, "You were right," at the kitchen table after Florence, and had not needed to say it again, because the numbers had said it every month after that. At his funeral, the minister said that Eric Halvorsen had been a man who trusted his hands and his eyes, and the tides he had grown up reading. Maggie sat in the front pew with Sam beside her, 20 years old by then, and thought that was exactly right, and that she had learned it from her grandfather and her father-in-law both. Let me tell you about the Oyster plant, because the plant's part of the story did not end where you might expect. Wade Coburn retired from the Coastal Shell Company in 2017. Before he left, he came out to the shed one afternoon and stood on the gravel and finally understood 6 years late where his surplus loads had been going. He took his cap off. He said, "I wondered what happened to that shell." Maggie made him a cup of coffee. They sat at the kitchen table for an hour. The new hauler after Wade did not make the same mistake. But by then, Maggie had already sat down with the plant manager and worked out a formal shell recovery contract that gave Halvorsen Coastal Shell right of first refusal on all surplus material above a defined grading threshold. She paid the plant a nominal $30 per ton for the shell, which was less than half of what they had been paying to have it hauled to the dredge site. Both sides came out ahead. Harlan Meeks had been carrying Halvorsen Coastal Shell on Front Street since 2019. He sold an average of 42 sacks a month. He had developed a standard speech he gave to customers who picked up a sack and looked at the price and put it back down. The speech explained the bioavailability, the particle size, the calcium math for coastal soil, and the 10-year cost comparison against pelletized ag lime. It was the exact argument Maggie had made to him at the counter in April of 2012. He gave it without attribution. She had never asked him to. Let me tell you one last thing. In the spring of 2025, Sam, who was finishing his senior year at North Carolina State studying coastal restoration, came home for spring break and sat down at the kitchen table where Maggie had once sat with a mortar and pestle and a handful of oyster shell. Sam had a folder with him. He opened it and spread out several pages of notes and printed research and grant application forms. He said, "I want to talk to you about the reef substrate market." Maggie looked at the papers. Sam said, "The state is expanding oyster reef restoration funding by $18 million over the next 4 years. They need graded shell substrate at a specification that is smaller than our commercial garden grade, but larger than the powder we use for foliar spray. That fraction is currently a waste stream in our own operation. If we build a 4th grading tier and formalize a reef substrate product line, we could apply for state contracts." He had grant program data. He had a professor at NC State who had connected him with the State Reef Restoration Office. He had a notebook. Maggie looked at the folder for a long time. She looked at her son, sitting across the kitchen table with the particular expression of a young man who has done the work and knows it, and is waiting to see if his mother will understand that. She thought about October of 2011 and a truck driving away, and a heap of oyster shell settling into the shell path beside her grandfather's boat shed. She thought about Harlan Meeks' laugh. She thought about the iron mortar she had taken down from a hook in the shed and set on the kitchen table. She thought about Dr. Elias Thorne standing at the front of a lecture hall in Wilmington in the fall of 1998, saying that every material the ocean had ever made was worth more than the shipping cost of moving it. She thought about all of it for about 10 seconds. Then she said, "Show me the numbers." Sam turned to the second page of the folder. Outside, the tide was coming in on the creek the way it had every 6 hours for as long as the creek had been there. The old boat shed sat on its ridge above the water where her grandfather had built it up out of dredged spoil in 1952. The delivery van was parked in the shell drive with the Halvorsen name on the door. And somewhere on a nail in the back corner of the shed there was a small burlap sack of hand-crushed oyster shell from the very first batch in October of 2011, with a hand-lettered paper tag tied to it with a piece of jute twine. Sam had hung it there when he was 12 years old, and it had stayed there ever since. She had never taken it down. It was the kind of thing you kept not because it was perfect, but because it was the proof that you had started. Because it was the answer to the question of whether the gap between a thought at a kitchen window and the walk out the back door was too wide to cross. It wasn't. She built a business out of what the tide brought in. They laughed. The storm came. The wholesaler closed. The shell kept arriving, the notebook kept filling, and the young widow who once watched a truck drive away built something that will outlast the truck, and the plant, and every ceiling that anyone in Carteret County ever thought to name. A single burlap sack of hand-crushed oyster shell hanging on a nail in the corner of a shed can look, to a stranger, like nothing at all. It can look like leftover material from a job that was never quite finished. But every real business begins with an object like that. Something small, something imperfect, something that carries in it the exact moment when a person decided that what everyone else was throwing away was worth picking up and looking at once more.